In the fall of 1781, the United States was broke. The army hadn't been paid in months. The government had no money, no credit, and no way to move its soldiers. Until one man started signing his own name to notes worth more than $1 million. And because you're most likely wondering, that's worth $42 million today. It was paper, backed by nothing but his personal fortune and his word. People called them Morris notes. But whatever they were called doesn't matter. What matters is they funded the march that won the war. His name was Robert Morris. He was, at that moment, one of the richest and most powerful men in America. 17 years later, that same man would be locked inside a debtor's prison. This is the story of his rise to power. Robert Morris was born in Liverpool, England, on the 20th of January, 1734. His father was a tobacco agent who sailed off to the American colonies for work and left his young son behind. Robert didn't cross the Atlantic until he turned 13, and when he finally landed in Maryland, he barely knew the father he'd come to live with. He wouldn't have him for long, though. In 1750, Robert's father was killed, not in a duel and not in a war, but at a celebration held in his own honor. A ship was slowly passing by the party when it fired a salute, and the wadding from the cannon struck him in the arm. It didn't turn out to be too great of a party. The wound turned fatal. Robert was only 16 and nearly alone in this new country. But before his untimely passing, his father had done a smart thing. He'd placed the boy as an apprentice in the counting house of Charles Willing, one of the most respected merchants in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was the largest and richest city in the colonies, and its wealth ran on trade. Ships hauling flour, tobacco, and rum across the Atlantic. They all came to Philadelphia. Morris took to the business immediately. He was sharp with numbers, calm under pressure, and unafraid of risk. When Charles Willing died, the firm passed to his son, Thomas. And in 1757, at just 23 years old, Robert Morris was made a full partner. At that point, the firm became Willing, Morris and Company. For the first 20 years, it was one of the most powerful trading firms in America. Morris grew rich. Very rich. He owned ships, warehouses, and a fine Philadelphia mansion. By the eve of the Revolution, he was considered one of the richest men in all of America. Then came the fight with Britain. When Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765, Morris opposed it. Any tax on the colonies was a threat to his trade. But he was no radical. He was a businessman with everything to lose, and he feared a war he wasn't sure the colonies would win, or could win. So when independence came up for a vote in the summer of 1776, Morris did something remarkable. He believed it was premature. But rather than cast a vote against it, he deliberately stayed away from the chamber. He was like me during fourth periods of senior year in high school. He just didn't go. His absence let Pennsylvania's divided delegation swing behind independence and carry it. A month later, he signed the Declaration himself. And he wrote, "I'm not one of those politicians that run testy when my own plans are not adopted. I think it is the duty of a good citizen to follow when he cannot lead." So he had a reasonable take. But now the country had chosen war, which put him in a pretty weird position because now all he could really do was make sure it could afford to fight one. That turned out to be the hardest job in America. Congress could print money, but its paper was nearly worthless. It could beg the states for funds, but the states mostly ignored it. The Continental Army was starving, unpaid, and coming apart at the seams. Morris became the man who kept it alive. Through the secret committees of Congress, he used his own ships and his own web of contacts to smuggle gunpowder, muskets, and supplies out of Europe, often on his own personal credit, with his own money on the line. I mean, if you're gonna do a revolutionary war, this guy's great to have on your team. In December of 1776, Washington's army was collapsing. The men's enlistments were about to expire, and they wanted to go home. Washington needed hard cash, real gold and silver, not some paper, to convince them to stay and fight, he wrote to Morris. And upon Morris receiving Washington's letter, Morris, the story goes, walked the streets of Philadelphia on New Year's Day, knocking on doors, borrowing coin on nothing but his signature. What do you think? Would you give him anything? Well, the money reached the camp. The soldiers stayed. Days later, Mere days later, they won at Trenton and Princeton, and the revolution survived. By 1781, the war was nearly bankrupt, and Congress finally turned to the one man who truly understood money. They named Robert Morris the Superintendent of Finance and handed him near total control over the young nation's economy. He ran the country's finances the way he ran his own firm. He slashed spending, renegotiated debts, and when the government's credit failed completely, he replaced it with his own. He issued notes signed by his own hand that circulated as currency, because people trusted Robert Morris more than they trusted the United States. He founded the Bank of North America, the first true bank in the country's history. And when the decisive moment came, the long march south to trap the British Army at Yorktown, it was Morris who found the money to move it. He raised over $1.5 million on his personal credit to feed and transport the army. In October of 1781, the British surrendered. The war was won. And it had been won, in no small part, on the personal signature of a single merchant from Philadelphia. When the fighting ended, Robert Morris was arguably the most powerful man in America not named George Washington. He had bankrolled the revolution. He had already signed the Articles of Confederation, and in 1787 he signed the Constitution too, one of only a handful of men to put his name on both that and the Declaration of Independence. And when Washington became president, he offered Morris the very first job in his cabinet, Secretary of the Treasury. Morris turned it down and pointed the president toward a brilliant young protege instead, Alexander Hamilton. Heard of him? Instead, Morris took a seat as one of Pennsylvania's first United States senators. He had climbed from an orphaned apprentice to the financier of a nation. He looked untouchable. And then he reached too far. Morris poured his fortune into land, buying up millions of acres of American wilderness through his North American Land Company, betting that a flood of settlers would make him richer than any man to ever live. To do it, he borrowed staggering sums, but the settlers didn't come fast enough. A financial panic swept the country in 1796, and credit dried up. Suddenly, all of his debts came due at once. The richest man in America ran out of money. In 1798, Robert Morris, signer of the Declaration, financier of the Revolution, was arrested for debt and locked inside the Prune Street prison in Philadelphia. He would remain there for 3.5 years. He was finally freed only by a new national bankruptcy law. A law made possible by the very financial system he had helped build. He lived his last years quietly and died in 1806, nearly forgotten. The man who had once funded an entire nation could not in the end fund himself. But at the moment America needed it most, when the government had nothing, Robert Morris put his own name on the line. And that was enough to buy a country its freedom. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you want more videos like this.